Hello and welcome to FortiGuard Live. I'm Derek Manky and I'm joined once again by Aamir Lakhani. Good to see you again, Aamir. How are you doing?
I am wonderful. I'm actually super today.
I think I saw that coming for some reason. Great to see you as always. So, first half 2021, a lot of stuff happened. We released our global threat landscape report, a lot of great data in there. There's a really good story in here in terms of innovation with FortiGuard Labs, right? We have well over 100 patents associated just with FortiGuard Labs and threat intelligence and detection. But there's so much happening behind the scenes. Of course, everything that we do and talk about and show in the report for protection of customers and all those great updates to mitigate and fight threats and detect them. But there's really a lot of stuff going on in the labs, and I know, Aamir, you have your hands in this every day, as a threat researcher with us. So I wanted to talk about that. And one of the most exciting things to me is some new data that we showed in the report with specifically MITRE ATT&CK TTP data and heat maps. And so maybe let's talk about that a little bit, because this is new, right? This is an innovative piece, and for the first time, we've highlighted real data for over that period of the first half of 2021, not just showing about all the things we traditionally talk about, which are relevant, right? Botnets and the attack surface with what exploits and CVEs are moving and those sorts of things. But this is really zooming in further into the malware and the attacks themselves. What are the capabilities and what tools are they actually using out of their back pockets, so to speak? That's quite interesting. The way we've done this is we actually showed the relevant MITRE ATT&CK TTP data, so techniques, tactics, and procedures. And it's a completely new strategic view, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me make sure like everyone kind of understands the impact of this, because we're not only talking about a lot of types of different attacks. You have that every day. Every day you have new types of attacks, different types of attacks, or just a lot of quantity of attacks. And that we're not only talking about the tools that attackers are using behind the attack, which is really valuable by itself just to understand the attacks, but we're talking very specifically about the techniques the attackers are using. And I think that's actually pretty exciting to me as a researcher, because I get to zero in and focus on the exact techniques they're using at specific moments during that life cycle of that attack. So when we're talking about initial access, when we're talking about data exfil, when we're talking about persistence, like what are the actual techniques that they're using? What are the tools behind the techniques? And also, what is like the likelihood, or what is the percentage of total attacks we're seeing focused on a particular technique? And that's, to me as a defender, that's interesting, because now I know where to focus on. Instead of like basically trying to boil the ocean, I can like really just come down to like my own kettle, my own pot, and figure out where I really need to concentrate on.
Yeah, I completely agree. And boiling the ocean, that's something that has been a challenge for too many people, and quite frankly, the wrong approach. It's too easy to be overwhelmed in the world of threat intelligence. And the number one thing I talk to CISOs about, the problem that they're facing is event fatigue, right? Too many logs coming in. How do I know there's a lot of bad things out there. How do I prioritize response? And you're right. You hit the nail on the head with that. That's exactly what we're doing with the innovation piece, to be able to stack rank that, basically show a heat map in terms of red, orange, and green. What are the ones really that are the top priority? Do you have relevant solutions that stack up from it? So as an example, like a couple of things that we showed in the report was, and no surprise here, but again, these are real problems that the world's facing, right? Privilege escalation, defense evasion. Attackers are always trying to get around security controls. But if you know exactly how they're doing that and the techniques, it does two things in my point of view, right? One, it obviously helps from a defender's standpoint. It helps CISOs and SOCs and NOCs be able to understand, what are those techniques? Do I have solutions and in place, because this is how I prioritize response. The other thing is, and I really like this one, is when we publish this, and there's more general awareness, it also exposes that to the cyber criminals. This is the pyramid of pain that we've talked about before, right? It's harder for them to change, their methodologies, their techniques and their tools and the way they're going in, than it is to change an IP address, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I look at that heat map, I think to myself, okay, if there's a weighted percentage, if there's a technique that's being used off and like, 30, 40, 60% of the time, whatever that number is, I start thinking to myself like, well, first of all, why is that the case? I mean, obviously it's because it's successful, right? It's successful to attackers, but is it because it's so successful they're not even trying any other methodologies or techniques, or is it that they really have no other way of getting to the same type of data and accomplishing the same tasks? Now, that's really $1 million question. I don't think we can answer that for each organization, but I will tell you what organizations need to do is they need to kind of look at that heat map and understand, or actually ensure that they can detect those techniques. So when we look at like persistency, or we look at like privilege escalation, the actual techniques, and even if the tools change, if the techniques are exploited, can your organization detect that regardless of the malware, the actual attack that's being used? Basically, that's red teaming in a nutshell. It's kind of like a type of red teaming, I would say, but I think it's very important for organizations to focus on what attackers are focusing on and making sure they can detect those solutions and hopefully even mitigate and stop those solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I call this high resolution threat intelligence because it really is putting this under a microscope too. And some of the techniques, this is the nature of MITRE ATT&CK, is that they can be very specific. As an example, if we look at, there's over 55% for privilege escalation. So when users not users, but the malicious users, the adversaries are trying to get onto a system, obviously they need to raise privileges like to administrators so they can execute code properly, establish a foothold and persistency. Over 55% of that activity was API hooking, as an example. So that's a specific technique. A lot of malware does use that, but it still shows how they need, this is part of the kill chain story. They need to be able to do that still before they can be successful. So if you can stop that problem, things like solutions on the EDR front, obviously sandbox, integrated sandboxing, on that sort of stuff, really the payload side, it can actually go a long way to mitigate the attack. It's that same kill chain story, but at a higher resolution, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was an interesting piece, part of the report, part of the findings, the API hooking. And I want to make sure we understand what that means, because first of all, we hear about APIs a lot. APIs are really important in a cloud-based, hyper-connected world where you need, multiple software systems and hardware systems to talk to each other. And how do they do that? Well, they do that through APIs. What malware is doing with API hooking is it's really changing the fundamental behavior or adding behavior to those software processes, almost like a man-in-the-middle attack, but much more on the software side, where it's actually injecting that malicious component. And I don't want to say malicious software because it's not always a malicious process. Maybe it's just changing behavior, or it's maybe changing the functionality of the software. But basically, the attacker is doing something to manipulate or to augment whatever malicious threat that they want to expose. And because APIs are so prevalent everywhere we use, whether it's networking or software development or pretty much every technique, this attack threat surface is pretty large, and that's a problem. And a lot of people, they're not really looking into like limiting API calls or understanding like what the vulnerability or what the exposure is with API calls throughout an entire organization. But you can be sure that shadow users, the attackers, whatever you want to call them, are definitely doing that.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing about that, again, no surprise, but it's an important piece. And unfortunately, going back to your point, that you mentioned earlier, I really do think this is still the low-hanging fruit for attackers. We talk about the low-hanging fruit all the time when it comes to social engineering, phishing emails, these sorts of things. This is another example, I think, because they are being successful, right? This is still their preferred method of attack. Of course, with the API hooking too, this is like the world of rootkits and how they work, right? I mean, they're trying to hide everything. Once they get a foothold, it gets even worse because they try to hook as many APIs as they can, even like file directories saying there's no file here when it actually doesn't exist. Of course, they're just hooking that API and cloaking everything essentially. So that's the other piece we saw, was the defensive Asian focus and lateral movement too. That's included in this chart, where we actually saw over 70% of lateral movement was still being preferred to or done on removable media. Again, an older technique, but still very prevalent, right?
Yeah, I was a little surprised to hear that, but you know, in some ways. But if you think about like how many times do we exchange files for USBs for other types of removable media, it happens like multiple times a day. And especially like as we start going back into the office and working in like small groups, I think that's even going to be like much exposed, even much more. It's such an easy attack. There are like rootkits and basically documentation online to show you how to build a basically a rogue USB stick that as soon as you plug in, it basically connects to a command and control system. And a lot of times you can even take over keyboard. You can actually like write those programs in ASCII. You're bypassing like, antivirus. They're old school methods that work really, really well.
Yeah, and all the more reason, like I talked about with that kill chain story, to be able to have end-to-end coverage and detection for these things. A lot of the things, especially when we start talking about MITRE attack, it's important to have mitigation pieces and solutions that can detect this. This is actually where our data is coming from, of course, because we have within the fabric our sandbox EDR that speaks and breathes MITRE attacks. So it's important to be able to detect those too, to even be able to defeat trivial things like the removable media too. It's a very strong innovation piece. We're also contributing as a research sponsor to the MITRE Ingenuity Center for Threat Informed Defense, as a sightings ecosystem project, which is all about this, right? How can we actually get that Venn diagram problem of threat intelligence in the industry, better understand this, look at the verticals and so forth too. So there's a lot happening there. Really exciting stuff. And this is really trying to help solve that. How do I prioritize my response? So a lot of interesting things to come on this. The other piece, switching gears from MITRE, that of course we talked about in the report that I'm also very excited about, is the good news in the industry, right? There's actual progress that has been made. We're up against, this is always a frontline fight. This is always the war on cybercrime that we talk about. Of course, we're doing a lot of great efforts with trying to solve these problems within FortiGuard Labs. So the MITRE piece is part of it. Working with the World Economic Forum, we're a founding member of the Center for Cybersecurity, working with the Partnership Against Cybercrime. We're always working behind the scenes to try to find malicious infrastructure, to try to find at the end of the day, attribution, who's behind these, how many different ransomware gangs are there, and contribute that, right, in terms of disruption. And I think that's a very important word. How do we, disrupt cybercrime? It's an industry piece, but something that we saw and highlighted in this threat landscape report, TrickBot specifically, that's a good example. I mean, there's other good examples. Emotet was one of them that went down in January, and it never returned to its previous levels. It's still been there because it's the whack-a-mole game, but the strategy is becoming better, and it went more than half of its previous activity, and it stayed at this new low watermark now. Same thing with TrickBot, went offline in Q4 last year. It came back. We noticed a resurgence in June, but it took 6 months for it to come back, and it's not nearly as prolific as it was before.
Yeah, I think you're seeing a very deliberate effort that we really hadn't seen in the past before, with multiple industries, multiple levels of government getting involved and taking cyber very seriously. One of the things, like we don't always like to be the bearer of bad news, but one of the things with cyber itself is a lot of cyber defensive solutions. When we take down a lot of things, it involves for the whole industry not only the technical piece but also the legal piece. So a lot of times you can't really advertise a lot of your wins, and a lot of those wins take a long time to just work through the systems that really have nothing to do with any technical limitations, right? It's just like different processes. So a lot of times we don't hear about that, and I think now that we are starting to hear more and more about it, is because it shows you not only are people getting deliberate about stopping their attacks, but I think finally maybe the non-technical pieces, the political pieces, are kind of catching up to the real world and making sure that everyone understands that we're all in this together. We really are, and we all have to make a continuous effort to stop these attacks from a technical and a non-technical piece. And I'm pretty happy to see that. It's like pretty exciting that, hey, okay, people get it, and we have to move fast, and we have to stop these attacks in multiple ways.
Yeah, and I think it's important for everyone to know that everybody has their role. When we say we, of course, we often talk about our labs in the industry and how we work together, but even down to organizations, they have their role too, right? It's the education piece, the training, the hardening of defenses that make add more resiliency to networks. That is also helping to disrupt cybercrime. So it really is a multi-stakeholder effort. Aamir, it's great to speak with you again. Super, in fact. Thanks for joining me. It's always wonderful talking to you. A lot of great data in the report, a lot of exciting things happening. You can check that again on blog.fortinet.com and all of our latest threat research updates under the threat research category. I'm Derek Manky once again with FortiGuard Live. Take care.